Welcome to Infinite Learnopedia channel. This is the second video of the IoT Internet of Things lecture series. The second video of the lecture series of IoT covers Raspberry Pi. This video covers the following points. Number 1. What is Raspberry Pi? Number 2. How did the Raspberry Pi get its name? Next, history. Fourth point, launch date of Raspberry Pi models. Fifth point, component of Raspberry Pi. Next one is how Raspberry Pi works. Next, project developed with the help of Raspberry Pi. Eighth point is Raspberry Pi in IoT. And the last point, advantages and disadvantages of Raspberry Pi. Let's get started with what is Raspberry Pi. A Raspberry Pi is a credit card sized computer originally designed for education. Look at the figure to the right side. The figure illustrates Raspberry Pi. It is a credit card sized computer. Second point is, it is a motherboard containing different slots like USB port, audio jack, memory slots, and Ethernet port, etc. It is slower than a modern laptop or desktop, but is still a complete Linux computer and can provide all the expected abilities that implies at a low power consumption level. Let's move on to the next point of the lecture. How did the Raspberry Pi get its name? Its name is a combo of fruit name plus Python. A lot of computer companies were named after fruit. For example, Tangerine Computer Systems, Apricot Computers. And the third example is Old British company Acorn, which is a family of fruit. Pi is because originally we were going to produce a computer that could only run Python. So the Pi in there is for Python. History of Raspberry Pi. It was created in February 2012. First generation Raspberry Pi 1 Model B was launched. It is developed in the UK by the Raspberry Pi Foundation. Here is a list of some features of Raspberry Pi 1 Model B. Let's talk about memory. Its memory is about 512 MB RAM. Connections: 2 USB ports with 100 MB Ethernet port, 3.5 mm jack for audio out, and HDMI. It contains a processor that is Broadcom BCM2835. This is the list of the Raspberry Pi with models. Raspberry Pi models with launched year. Number 1 is Raspberry Pi 1. It was launched in the year Feb 2012. This is Model B and it is basic model. Number 2 model, Raspberry Pi 1 Model B Plus, launched in the year April 2014. It is credit card sized. In the later year released improved models A Plus and B Plus. Next model is Raspberry Pi 2, launched year February 2015 with added more RAM. Next up is Raspberry Pi 0 model, launched year is November 2015. It is GPIO, that is general purpose input output. Next model is Raspberry Pi 3 Model B, released on the year Feb 2016. It contains onboard Wi-Fi, Bluetooth and USB boot capabilities. And the last model latest model Raspberry Pi 0W, launched year is Feb 28, 2017. It is identical to the Raspberry Pi 0 but has the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth functionality. This is the list of all the Raspberry Pi with models and launched year. This slide contains all the pictures of the Raspberry Pi models. Components of Raspberry Pi. All of these components are on the Raspberry Pi board, as you can see in the figure towards right side. So this is the USB port, then audio jack with 3.5 mm, HDMI high definition multimedia interface, power supply, then next is SD card slot, Ethernet, LED light emitting diode, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, CSI camera serial interface, connector for camera, and etc. Next point is how it works, how this Raspberry Pi works. Let's cover points one by one. First point is an HDMI television or monitor. How it works with this. To connect your Raspberry Pi to a display, which means you will need an HDMI enabled screen of some kind. For example, TV or monitor. You need a cable and you can connect it. Second is a USB keyboard and mouse. In order to control your Pi, you will need a keyboard and mouse. At this point, pretty much an USB keyboard and mouse will work. Third one is an 8GB micro SD card and card reader. 8GB card for this. If your computer doesn't have a card reader, then you will need a hard drive. And the fourth is a power supply. Raspberry Pi is powered by a micro USB. Since the Pi 3 model has 4 USB ports, it's best to use a good power supply that can provide at least 2.5 ampere of current. Look at this picture. This is a Raspberry Pi model example where all the connection is done, like HDMI, mouse, keyboard, SD card, 2 speakers, and such others. Next is the table which shows the Raspberry Pi models with all the components. In the table there are 3 models Raspberry Pi, first model, second and third. With components, first component is the release date, second is the CPU, that is processor of the Raspberry Pi, third is the CPU speed, next is RAM, then GPU, graphical processing unit of the 3 models, storage, different storage slots for the Raspberry Pi. Second last is the USB ports. First model has 2 ports on model B. Raspberry Pi 2 and 3 has 4 USB ports. And last is Wi-Fi. There is no built-in Wi-Fi in first and second model, whereas the latest model, third model, contains Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Next point of the tutorial is project developed with the help of Raspberry Pi. Here are some of the projects. First is Simple Desktop. Number 2 is Raspberry Pi Smart Mirror, a mirror which displays applications and other useful information. Number 3 is Gaming Device. Number 4 is Robot. Number 5 is CCTV camera. Next point is Raspberry Pi in IoT. Using Raspberry Pi, we can create various sensors of IoT. Example number 1 is IoT doorbell. This project shows an automatic doorbell which sends an SMS or email. Thus, the owner can easily monitor from anywhere if someone knocks his door. Second example here is review on temperature and humidity sensing using IoT. This is a novel method using Raspberry Pi. Third is home automation using IoT. Internet of Things allows us to implement home automation system that can be controlled remotely through internet. The proposed system can monitor different parameters like gas, light, motion detection, temperature, etc. using the sensor data and also trigger a process according to the requirement. The data from the sensors are uploaded to a cloud server and this data can be used to analyze the parameters. Fourth example is waterproof sensor, etc. The last point of the video is advantages and disadvantages of Raspberry Pi. Starting with the advantages, first advantage of Raspberry Pi is it is small in size. Second is it is inexpensive, that is it is low cost. Third is low cost server and hosting ability to handle web traffic. Fourth is open source and it can be used as supercomputer. Disadvantages of Raspberry Pi. Number 1 is it cannot run x86 OS and number 2 is low processor. This is all about Raspberry Pi. If you have any questions related to Raspberry Pi, let me know in the comments box below. I will definitely answer your questions related to IoT. Thank you for watching this video. Stay tuned for upcoming videos on IoT.